The year is 1933. The setting is the gilded halls of Stockholm, Sweden. The air is thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the murmur of the world's intellectual elite. A man stands at the podium, bathed in the warm golden glow of adulation. He is Thomas Hunt Morgan, a titan of biology, a man whose name is about to be etched into the granite of history as the father of chromosomal genetics. As the heavy gold medal is placed into his hand, the Nobel Prize in physiology or medicine, the flashbulbs pop, capturing the image of the solitary genius who unlocked the secrets of life itself. History tells us that this man proved that chromosomes carry the hereditary traits that make us who we are. Textbooks for the next century will lionize him. They will say he brought order to the chaos of biology. They will say he was the first. But history is often a curated fiction, a story written by the victors to flatter their own reflections. If you look closely at that photograph from 1933, you might notice the shadows stretching long and dark behind the podium. If you listen past the thunderous applause, you might hear the silence of a voice that was systematically stifled. Because the empire of Thomas Hunt Morgan, this monument to male genius, was built on a foundation laid by someone else. A foundation he first mocked, then dismissed, and finally, when the architect was no longer there to defend herself, claimed as his own. We are taught that science is the pursuit of objective truth, immune to the petty biases of human ego. We like to believe that a great discovery shines so brightly it cannot be ignored. But the story of genetics contains a glitch, a terrifying error in the record. There is a name that was carefully erased from the margins of the papers that Morgan cited. There is a ghost haunting the laboratory notes. While Morgan stood in the spotlight, accepting the highest honor a scientist can receive, the true pioneer of his theory lay in a premature grave, her legacy slowly dissolving into the dust of forgotten archives. This isn't just a story about a stolen prize. It is an autopsy of a theft that delayed our understanding of biology for a generation. It is the story of how the scientific establishment, blinded by the dogma that women were incapable of high-level abstract thought, chose to celebrate a man who was wrong over a woman who was right. The father of genetics did not build his house alone. He dismantled the house of a woman named Nettie Stevens and used the bricks to build his own pedestal. Today, we open the dusty file marked 1905 and expose the uncomfortable truth that lies beneath the Nobel veneer. We return the name to the discovery.
Let us transport ourselves back to 1905. The world is a different place, a place where the very mechanisms of life are still shrouded in superstition and wild conjecture. We are at Bryn Mawr College, a sanctuary for female intellect in a world that largely disregarded it. In a small, dimly lit laboratory, surrounded by the smell of formaldehyde and the scratching of pen on paper, sits Nettie Stevens. She is not the dashing young hero of a serialized novel. She is 39 years old, a woman who fought tooth and nail just to enter the room. While the great men of science are in grand lecture halls debating philosophy, Stevens is doing the work. She is hunched over a brass microscope, staring into the infinite complexity of the mundane. Her subject? The common mealworm, Tenebrio molitor. It is unglamorous, tedious work. Hour after hour she dissects, stains, and observes. At this time, the scientific consensus on what determined sex was, frankly, embarrassing. Learned men with tenure and reputations, argued that gender was determined by the mother's diet, or the temperature of the womb, or even the vigor of the father at the moment of conception. It was viewed as an environmental accident, a roll of the dice influenced by external chaos. But Nettie Stevens saw something else. As she peered through her lenses, adjusting the focus until the cellular structures snapped into sharpness, she noticed a pattern that defied the chaotic theories of her peers. She observed the chromosomes, the tiny thread-like structures inside the cell. She saw that female mealworms possessed 20 large chromosomes, but the males? The males were different. They had 19 large ones and one tiny, peculiar straggler, a Y chromosome. It was a moment of absolute crystalline clarity, the eureka moment that scientists dream of but few achieve. Stevens realized that this wasn't an accident. This tiny biological difference was the key. Sex wasn't determined by the heat of the sun or the food on the plate. It was written into the very architecture of the organism at the moment of conception. X and Y, the fundamental binary of biological sex. She hadn't just categorized a bug part, she had discovered the machinery of destiny. With the meticulous precision of a master surgeon, Stevens documented her findings. She didn't speculate, she proved. She wrote a paper, Studies in Spermatogenesis, that was elegant, undeniable, and revolutionary. She laid the map of heredity on the table, a map that showed exactly how we become who we are. She had solved the mystery that had baffled humanity for millennia. But she had committed the cardinal sin of the Edwardian era. She was a woman who was right when the men were wrong. And the man she looked up to, the man who should have championed her genius, was about to become her greatest obstacle.
The antagonist of our story now steps fully into the light. Thomas Hunt Morgan was not just a colleague, he was a mentor figure, a giant in the field, and a man deeply invested in his own theories. When Stevens presented her revolutionary findings that chromosomes determined sex, Morgan didn't applaud. He didn't rush to verify her work with the excitement of a partner. Instead, he sneered. Writing in the prestigious journal Science, he dismissed her conclusion as trifling and nonsense. He was a staunch opponent of the idea that chromosomes carried hereditary information. To him, the idea that a tiny speck of matter could determine the complexity of an organism was absurd. He publicly rejected her work, using his massive influence to cast a shadow of doubt over her crystal-clear discovery. But here is where the tragedy turns into a scandal. As the years ticked by, the evidence for Stevens' theory became overwhelming. Other scientists began to replicate her work. The truth was marching on, with or without Morgan's approval. And Morgan, being a shrewd political operator, saw the tide turning. He didn't apologize. He didn't publish a retraction of his insults. Instead, he quietly, insidiously pivoted. He began to incorporate the chromosomal theory of inheritance into his own work. He adopted the very concepts he had once mocked, polishing them up and presenting them as the fruits of his own fly-room experiments with Drosophila. Tragedy struck in 1912. Nettie Stevens, at the height of her intellectual powers, died of breast cancer. She was only 50 years old. Her voice was silenced, her pen stilled. She left behind no powerful institution to fight for her legacy, no winnow to sue for her rights. She was simply gone, and Thomas Hunt Morgan breathed a sigh of relief. With Stevens out of the way, the path was clear. Over the next 2 decades, Morgan built his empire on the chromosomal theory. When the Nobel Committee came calling in 1933, they awarded the prize to Morgan for his discoveries concerning the role played by the chromosome in heredity. The irony is suffocating. The very theory he won for was the one Stevens had proven and he had rejected. In his Nobel lecture, did he pour one out for Nettie? Did he acknowledge the woman whose shoulders he stood upon? Hardly. He mentioned her only as a minor contributor, a footnote in his grand saga, effectively erasing her agency and her brilliance. He won the Nobel, she won oblivion. It is a theft of intellectual property on a grand scale, sanctioned by the highest courts of science.
But today, we break that silence. We scratch out the name Morgan and write in the name Stevens, because while he may have the medal, she had the truth. And in the long, unbending arc of history, truth is the only legacy that matters.